Welcome to our sectional for this morning, and it is my name is Hillary Donaldson, and I'm president-elect of the Hymn Society. And it's my pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker for this morning. Stephanie A. Budwey is the Luce Dean's Faculty Fellow Assistant Professor of the History and Practice of Christian Worship and the Arts at Vanderbilt Divinity School in Nashville, Tennessee, where she also serves as Director of the Religion in the Arts and Contemporary Culture program. Her teaching and research focus on the relationships between social justice issues, liturgy, and the arts. Stephanie is an active member of the Hymn Society and currently serves as the Director of Research. She has presented lectures and papers throughout North America and Europe, and she has publications on such topics as intersex and theology, including Religion and Intersex, Perspectives from Science, Law, Culture, and Theology, forthcoming from Routledge 2022. And congratulations on that, Stephanie. Big deal. That's a big deal. Marian Congregational Song, including Sing of Mary, Giving Voice to Marian Theology and Devotion from Liturgical Press 2014, and Queer Hymnody, including the landmark online collection of the Hymn Society, Queering Congregational Song, Past Celebrations, Current Resources, and Hopes for the Future in the forthcoming collection, Queering Christian Worship, Reconstructing Liturgical Theology, as well as her role in Songs for the Holy Other of the Hymn Society. Pardon me, that's what I was thinking of. She currently serves as organist and parish musician at St. David's Episcopal Church in Nashville. I welcome those of you who are joining us here in the room, and I enthusiastically welcome those of you who are joining us via Zoom, and I'm coming back there in a moment to be your Zoom host, so it'll be a party in the Zoom chat. And Stephanie's presentation today is entitled Decolonizing Binary Language, Incorporating Intersex People in Congregational Song. Please join me in welcoming Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Hillary, for the welcome. Welcome, and thank you all for coming today, both those who are here in person and those joining us online. I'm excited to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation, which, God willing, will be the last 15 minutes. I've worked very hard to distill all this into an hour. So please feel free to follow along. You should have a handout in Sketch. Everything will also be up here on the PowerPoint, so depending on what's easiest for you to follow along with. This was submitted a few weeks ago, and I've tweaked it a little bit since then, so I apologize. Not everything might be in Sketch, but everything is here on the PowerPoint. What I will share with you today draws from my forthcoming book that Hillary mentioned, which comes out in August, Religion and Intersex, Perspectives from Science, Law, Culture, and Theology. I do have flyers here with a discount code if you're interested. For those of you online, ASM07. While we have made great strides in congregational song and working to include LGBTQIA+ folks, such as what Hillary mentioned, the Hymn Society's collection Songs for the Holy Other, the I is often overlooked or not understood. I say this while also acknowledging that not all intersex people identify as queer or wish to be included under the LGBTQIA+ umbrella. I hope that this presentation can begin to foster a discussion of the need to include all intersex people, regardless of how they identify, in congregational song, and how we can begin to do so. Next slide, please. I start with this image, Neither, by David Hayward. The artist's website calls the image a transgender Christ, referencing Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is neither male nor female. The dark-skinned Christ who is holding the transgender symbol is surrounded by a rainbow halo. Although Hayward describes this as a transgender Christ, and corresponding with him, you may know him as Naked Pastor, that's his handle. I asked if he felt if his image could be seen by intersex people as an intersex Christ, an image of Christ that could be seen as male, female, both male and female, or neither male nor female. Hayward responded, I love all of your explanations. They are all possible with this piece. Yes, that's the intention. Furthermore, in his message, he said, I'm all about unity, but also equally diversity, which means multiplicity. This piece visually offers an image of Christ that is both and neither, embracing the multiplicity of human embodiments, including intersex individuals, that reflect an image of God who is also both and neither. My book, Religion and Intersex, considers the situation of intersex people who have faced erasure in the areas of science, law, culture, and theology, due to the assumption that all humans are either female or male. A quick word about myself and my position in this research. I am endosex. For those who are not familiar, that's a term for those who are not intersex. I'm a cisgender woman, and this book is centered in interviews I conducted with intersex Christians in Germany. I argue that moving from a paradigm of sexual dimorphism to sexual polymorphism will help promote the full humanity and flourishing of intersex people by creating a world where intersex individuals are no longer coerced and or forced to undergo non-consensual, medically unnecessary treatment, no longer experience human rights violations because of their lack of legal protection, no longer feel inhuman and other due to epistemic injustice that stems from sociocultural norms and stereotypes, are no longer told they are not made in God's image as a result of a sexually dimorphic understanding of Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, and no longer feel excluded and invisible in worship services that do not recognize them. I describe the need for a theology of both neither, which acknowledges that intersex people exist. It's based on a sexually polymorphic reading of Genesis 1:27, that intersex people are made in God's image just as they are. They do not need to be corrected or fixed by medically unnecessary surgery in order to fit into the sexually dimorphic sex-gender binary. It also celebrates difference, the truth and reality of the diversity of God's creation and the multiplicity of human embodiment. In other words, I am arguing that we must employ a theology of both neither in our congregational song in order to truly sing the world God imagines. Today's presentation draws from the 5th chapter of my book, which focuses on liturgical language and congregational song, arguing that worship steeped in sexual dimorphism has led to the liturgical erasure of intersex people, making them feel unwelcome, invisible, and excluded in worship. I call this liturgical violence, a term I first heard from Paul Vasile, who heard the term from Jorge Lockwood. Here, I'm using it to describe liturgies that do not employ a theology of both neither. In contrast, liturgies of livability, a term that I first heard from Robin Henderson Espinoza, is how I describe liturgies that allow for the full humanity and flourishing of intersex people by employing a theology of both neither. Next slide, please. In order to consider how to go about decolonizing binary language in order to incorporate intersex people in congregational song, it's important to step back. I'm sorry, I'm a professor and a theologian and a liturgist, so you'll have to bear with me. I think it's important that we take a look at, first of all, what is intersex, because it's so misunderstood and not talked about. And there's a lot of stigma and shame around it. And also to share with you some of the experiences of my interview partners that they had in worship. Next is an examination of theologies based on a sexually dimorphic interpretation of Genesis 1:27 that exclude intersex people because they don't fit into the sex-gender binary, in contrast to a sexually polymorphic interpretation of Genesis 1:27. Much of our congregational song is steeped in sexual dimorphism, and not only employs these theologies, but also correspondingly uses binary language, feminine and masculine, to describe both God and humans. And so there will be an exploration of the need to decolonize binary language and move towards sexual polymorphism, which uses inclusive, expansive, and emancipatory language. Finally, I will highlight examples of congregational song. We're going to do some singing led by T. Wes Moore here, get you all singing. And we're going to look at these congregational songs that are doing the work of decolonizing binary language by providing text where all intersex people can see themselves reflected. Those who identify as a woman, as a man, as both woman and man, or as neither woman nor man, as they employ inclusive language for humans and expansive language for God, moving beyond binary language and toward a paradigm of sexual polymorphism that includes all human beings along the sex-gender continuum, including intersex people. While this presentation focuses on intersex people and their experiences, keeping in mind that there are many intersex people who identify within the sex-gender binary and some who do not, this move toward inclusive and expansive language will help to include all people who identify as non-binary. Next slide, please. Intersex people are born with sex characteristics, genes and chromosomes, internal and external genitalia and hormones that do not fit into what is typically considered to be female or male. So let's start with what is intersex and what are the experiences of these people in worship. While someone has intersex intervariations, they are often subjected to medically unnecessary, irreversible medical treatments, such as surgery and hormones, in order to bring their bodies in line with these sociocultural expectations. Many intersex people, including my interview partners, describe these medically unnecessary treatments as being physically and psychologically traumatic. Being born with intersex traits is as common as having red hair or green eyes, up to 1.7% of births, which means that there are intersex people in our congregations, and we need to pay attention to how we can make them feel welcome and included. A quick word on terminology. Sex here is meaning corresponding terms of female, male, or intersex to talk about biological traits, and gender are the corresponding terms woman, man, or non-binary refers to gender identity. These two words are often conflated, and because of that, I often refer to the sex-gender binary to describe the paradigm of sexual dimorphism where there are only two options, to be female and identify as a woman, or to be male and identify as a man. So it's just a binary, and it's also a cisgender binary. I use the term sex-gender spectrum or continuum to refer to the paradigm of sexual polymorphism that encompasses the two poles of male, female, woman, and man, and all those in between. I also just want to make a quick note. It's very important to note the difference between transgender and intersex, because the two terms are often confused. A person who is transgender has a gender that is different from the one they are traditionally associated with, the sex they were assigned at birth. And a person who is intersex was born with a variation in their sexual or reproductive anatomy such that their body doesn't fit into typical definitions of male or female. Correspondingly, someone who is cisgender has a gender that is the same from the one traditionally associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. And a person who is endosex has sexual or reproductive anatomy such that their body does fit the typical definitions of female or male. Next slide, please. In her article on queer worship, Siobhan Garrigan addresses the liturgical erasure of those who are outside of the sex-gender binary, including intersex people, those who she describes as having indeterminate sex organs. She says, I quote, "As you sing with the faithful in all times and places, how often have you sang in terms that were not based on heterosexist binaries? Father, mother, male and female. Are you invited to sing sopranos and altos, tenors and basses, or just as women and men, regardless of the voice that God gave you? How is sexual diversity talked about and otherwise imaged in your worship? How do you recognize that 1 in every 2,000 babies born with indeterminate sex organs, those who are intersex? How many prayers begin only brothers and sisters?" Has anyone in this room heard the word intersex uttered in a worship service? There are a few. All right, that's good, more than I expected, but still only a few. So, in most congregations, most folks have probably not heard this word, leading to the liturgical erasure of intersex people. I will share with you some of the experiences of my interview partners to give you a sense of how they have felt excluded in worship. Next slide, please. Liturgical language was one aspect of worship addressed by my interview partners. The use of binary language for humans leads to the liturgical erasure of those who identify outside of the sex-gender binary, including some intersex people and all those who identify as non-binary. This was the experience of one interview partner in the church who self-identifies as a hermaphrodite. And another word about language here, hermaphrodite is a word that some intersex people still feel is very harmful, while there are others who are reclaiming it. So when speaking to someone who is intersex, please don't use that word unless they tell you that is how that they identify. So this person had to ask their pastor to change the liturgical language in their worship. Earlier in their life, when they identified as a woman, they felt comfortable with the language of brothers and sisters. After identifying as a hermaphrodite, however, they felt excluded by this binary language. They said, I quote, "I'm seen as a woman, I think so, but now people who don't know me will think I'm a man. And I don't care about that too much, but when I hear text, brothers and sisters and men and women, I'm sitting in the church and I think, okay, you don't want me here? And I go then." They talked to one of the pastors and told them they felt excluded when he said men and women. After this conversation, the pastor used men and women, but when they saw my interview partner, they added, and all other people. For my interview partner, this made them feel good because they were recognized and that they felt that they were allowed to be there. Another pastor was using the language of men and women to pray the Psalms, so that men would recite certain verses and women the others. My interview partner spoke to him and said that they didn't feel comfortable with that. So the pastor stopped using the language of men and women and instead divided the congregation into left and right to pray the Psalms. When the seating tripled, they alternated between the pastor and the congregation. But the pastor continued to use the language of brothers and sisters and sons and daughters, which was very frustrating for my interview partner. When they went to a larger church, they told the pastor why they didn't like the language of men and women, yet the pastor continued to use this language, and it made my interview partner feel like they were not wanted. It was very hurtful for them. This interview partner acknowledged that the addition of sisters to brothers and sisters and mothers to fathers and mothers was a recent one due to the feminist movement. Yet these additions made my partner feel like they were leftovers. When asked what they would suggest, that they felt men, women, and all other people, or simply all people would be the best option, because by saying men, women, and hermaphrodites, they would still exclude people such as those who are transgender. Similarly, my dear friend Jeffrey Moore has a child who is not intersex but identifies as non-binary. And just the other day, he told me when he has to sing a song in worship, it says sons and daughters. It's incredibly painful for him because it excludes his child. The words that we sing matter. I will now offer a brief look at the foundational theologies behind binary language that creates liturgical violence. Next slide, please. Sexual dimorphism is a paradigm where people are seen to be naturally, in a normative sense, unequivocally and exclusively male, or unequivocally and exclusively female. Sexual polymorphism, however, does incorporate individuals who are not unequivocally and exclusively male or unequivocally and exclusively female. And therefore, it includes all human beings along the sex-gender continuum, including intersex people, those who identify as a woman or a man, those who identify as both woman or man, and those who identify as neither woman nor man. Religion has great control in the social construction of reality, including in determining norms around sex and gender. Many Christians believe that sexual dimorphism is natural and God-given due to a sexually dimorphic interpretation of Genesis 1:27, that God created all humans as clearly female or clearly male. Because intersex individuals possess sex characteristics that are a combination of what is considered to be male and female, some Christian teachings have labeled them as sinful, flawed, or fallen, and also see them as inhuman, to the point that Sally Gross, an intersex person, was told that she could not be baptized. That's liturgical violence. One interview partner challenged this interpretation, instead seeing the sex gender as a continuum. They said, I quote, "The Bible doesn't say God created humans as man and woman. It doesn't say that. God created humans in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, and he created them, one might translate, from male to female. That is completely different than male and female." It is entirely possible, as one interview partner put forth, to interpret this Genesis passage as one which supports sexual polymorphism. Biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholar and my colleague at Vanderbilt, Annalisa Azzoni, offers the following translation of Genesis 1:26-27. "And God said, 'Let us make an earthling in our image, after our likeness. They shall rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, the whole earth, and all the creeping things that creep upon earth.' And God created the earthling in God's image. In the image of God, God created it. Male and female, God created them." Azzoni posits that one possible reading of this text, rather than being used as it often has been to support a binary understanding of sex gender, can instead be interpreted as one of inclusion. She says, quote, "Why can I not then choose to read inclusion in the Genesis text today, telling me that God created us, all of us, in all of our differences and beautiful uniqueness, as reflected in that primordial being?" She emphasizes the movement between the singular and the plural in the text, both for humans and God, as a sign that the primordial being contained plurality, and that God created them, can therefore be read as all in all their differences. Justin Sabiatanis also highlights the use of the plural for God, arguing that it could refer to the plurality of God's own being, male, female, and beyond, which is broader than can be understood in a single term or gender. In other words, God created humans in God's image, reflecting the multiplicity of all possibilities of manifestations of sex gender on a spectrum between the poles of male and female. Rather than reading this as a text which sees female and male as oppositional, this passage can instead be interpreted as one of including all humans, including intersex people, as existing along a continuum, as my interview partner said, from male to female. Next slide, please. Sabiatanis helpfully explains that the entire story of creation contains multiple examples of God creating two poles and all that exists in between. An example of merism, as pointed out by Slat's tool to us I think it was in 2021 that Slats gave that talk to us at the Hymn Society. So merism is a rhetorical device that uses two extremes to evoke the whole. Sabiatanis writes that the creation God created not only night and day, but also dusk and dawn and all the moments in between that blur strict binaries, writing that, quote, "In the story of Genesis, even while God was creating apparent opposites, God also created liminal spaces in which elements of creation overlap and merge. Surely the same could be said about the creation of humanity, with people occupying many places between the poles of female and male in a way similar to the rest of creation. As a result, all people, including intersex people, are good and a part of God's creation." Next slide, please. So moving to binary language as opposed to inclusive, expansive, and emancipatory language. The experiences of my interview partner who felt excluded by the language used in worship is a stark reminder of the importance of liturgical language, not only as an act of hospitality to help all feel welcome, but as an act of social justice, as the church is called to be the body of Christ on earth, a body in which all are welcomed and loved. Additionally, the language used in worship is formative. It shapes understandings of who people are, who God is, and how humans relate to one another. For an excellent discussion of this, including topics outside of the sex-gender binary, including race, ethnicity, and ability, I really encourage you to look at the expansive and inclusive language guidelines from the New Mennonite Hymnal and Voices Together, the Worship Leader Edition. Adam Tice and Sarah Johnson also discuss this in their article, Our Journey with Just and Faithful Language, in the most recent issue of the hymn. And you can see those guidelines in that article. Because intersex people have already experienced what it means to not fit into the sex-gender binary, thinking creatively about language for God is helpful not only for intersex people, but is also important for endosex people who have been complicit in the colonization of the image of God through a theological anthropology which claims that sexual dimorphism is natural and God-given, along with the notion that to be a human being means you must be created clearly female or clearly male. By offering liturgical language for God and humans that reflect sexual polymorphism as opposed to sexual dimorphism, the hope is that people's consciousness will be shaped so that they are aware of the reality that intersex people exist, so they are no longer erased from the liturgy. So this discussion derives from and expands upon the work done by those in the feminist movement who have and continue to advocate for recognition of women in the liturgy. In her book on emancipatory language and hymns, Robin Knowles Wallace points to the work of Marjorie Proctor Smith and her three solutions to what she sees as the problem of androcentric liturgical language. The first is non-sexist language, which completely avoids gender terms. The second is inclusive language, which is a balance of gender terms. And the third is emancipatory language, which is challenging gender stereotypes. While Proctor Smith's model is very important in the work that has and is still being done in order to make women visible in the liturgy, adding feminine metaphors for God and sisters to brothers, women to men, and daughters to sons, it's based on a model of sexual dimorphism and therefore excludes, erases, and makes invisible all those who are outside of the sex-gender binary, including like my interview partner who identified as a hermaphrodite. However, it is important to reiterate that not all intersex people identify outside of the sex-gender binary, and there are intersex people who are comfortable with binary language in the liturgy. So in order to include everyone, the goal is then to use binary, feminine and masculine language, and non-binary or non-gendered language throughout the service so that all feel included and visible. Next slide, please. One church that is taking up the work of moving beyond the binary language is my church, the Episcopal Church. In their ongoing work of considering revisions to the Book of Common Prayer, the Task Force on Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision has created expansive and inclusive language guidelines. And I don't know if anyone here was at General Convention, but I know that just happened, and I'm still trying to parse out what of this was adopted or not in our very condensed meeting. But this was originally on the slate to be discussed last year, which became this year. Here, inclusive language is defined as language about and for humanity. Recognize that, quote, our language often has built-in biases that exclude and harm some persons. When exclusive language is used, we fall short of our calling to respect all who are created in the image of God. Expansive language is defined as language about and for God that, quote, seeks to tell us as much truth about God as we can, utilizing the full range of language available to us. It does not displace traditional language for God, but uses additional metaphors. The expansive inclusive language guidelines crucially take into account people who identify as non-binary. Quote, as much as possible, it is important to avoid binaries as standing for the whole of humanity. For example, brothers and sisters may exclude those who are gender non-binary. End quote. It also speaks to the importance of naming, saying that, quote, all worshiping communities deserve to name themselves and have their names be honored, end quote. Additionally, it points to how gendered language for God can lead some people to feel as they were not made in God's image, quote. We seek language for God that implicitly acknowledges that all of humanity is created in the image of God, being mindful in particular ways that gendered language for God can sometimes imply otherwise, end quote. This document also helpfully points out the limits of language, its possibility of being harmful, and the importance of language in shaping our sense of reality, as well as our relationships with God and each other. It is important to state here that the goal is not to eradicate binary language from congregational song, but rather to employ Sally McFaig's argument for the use of numerous images of God, saying that, quote, many metaphors and models are necessary, that a piling up of images is essential, both to avoid idolatry and to attempt to express the richness and variety of the divine-human relationship, end quote. Christianity teaches that all humans are made in the image of God, and therefore it is important to have multiple images of God to represent the multiplicity of human embodiment. This means using a combination of both binary and non-binary language for God and humans. Similarly, in her study of the use of gendered Trinitarian language, liturgical language scholar Gail Ramshaw does not advocate for its complete removal. Rather, she writes that Father, Son, and Spirit language should be alternated with other models and formulations, each of which indicates some aspect of doctrinal truth, each of which needs correctives from other doctrinal formulations. Brian Wren describes that having the option to choose between many images and names for God forces people to remember that there is not one word that can fully express the depth of God's being. The Evangelical Lutheran Worship Supplement All Creation Sings provides a very helpful resource of 100 scriptural images for God, many of which are not gendered. This includes God as a quality, an element of nature, an object, an animal, a woman, a man, an embodied person, a human being, and a divine being. These images offer many ways to incorporate expansive language for God in the liturgy with the ability to use both binary and non-binary language. Furthermore, Ruth Duck and Patricia Wilson-Kastner put forward very helpful suggestions in their book on inclusive language, Praising God, the Trinity, and Christian Worship. One example is the adaptation of the traditional baptismal formula that's used at Riverside Church in New York. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, adding one God, Mother of us all. In considering how to incorporate inclusive language in the liturgy, when singing, as we know here at the Hymn Society, instead of using the language of women's voices and men's voices, to use the language of upper voices and lower voices, to include those who don't identify as women or men. Instead of saying brothers and sisters, as one interview partner experienced, language can be added, so that it could be sisters, brothers, and all children of God. Additionally, one could use language that is not gendered. Slat's Tools has some examples such as people of God, siblings and friends and family of Christ. As we saw yesterday in our hymn festival, siblings and friends can easily replace women and men. And I how that works syllabically when we sang For Everyone Born and we changed the language for that. These are small changes that make a tremendous difference in creating a worship space where all feel welcome, named, and included. Nate Myrick attends to the importance of congregational music in declaring identity in humanity, arguing that, quote, "It is ethical when it enables human flourishing for each individual in the community." Additionally, he argues that congregational music is ethical when it calls out injustice, when it names violations of human capabilities and acts of oppression and the realities that prohibit flourishing. In the words of Carl P. Dodd Jr., church music should be subversive. Congregational song should be a place in the liturgy that decries the injustices that intersex people have suffered, while also helping to create a space for their flourishing. So now, since it's a hymn society, we move to the singing part. We're going to look at some examples of congregational song that can lead to liturgies of livability. Next slide, please. Tom Troger expresses the importance of language in congregational song. He says, quote, "There is a growing consciousness of how all speech and writing, including poetry, is an extension of the web of language, value, and meaning that interconnects us. This awareness includes a heightened theological sensitivity to the tyrannies of language, the hierarchies of power that are reflected and reinforced by the way we talk about our reality," end quote. Drawing on the work of Proctor Smith, who describes how our imaginations, and not just women's, have been colonized, Troger posits that to decolonize the liturgical imagination of congregational song requires a whole new poetry. This section offers illustrations from congregational song that are doing the work of decolonization by providing texts that are inclusive, expansive, and emancipatory. Troger's 1987 text, Source and Sovereign, Rock and Cloud, is an example in that it exclusively uses what Proctor Smith would label non-sexist language and what Robin Knowles Wallace considers emancipatory. Throughout the hymn, Troger uses 40 names and metaphors for all three persons of the Trinity, all of which are non-gendered, giving an example of McFaig's call for a piling up of images. The first stanza offers multiple names and images for the first person of the Trinity. Additionally, Troger juxtaposes images that can be seen as contradictory, such as judge, defender, mercy, and might, highlighting that each image of God is describing both who and what God is and is not. The second stanza draws from the New Testament to name the second person of the Trinity. The final stanza moves to the third person of the Trinity as presence, love, and energies that never tire. The juxtaposition of many different visual illusions that are existing side by side creates an effect where they, quote, "both complement and destabilize each other," keeping people from holding only one representation for God in the move toward expansive language. So I hope it's able to be read here. If not, I hope you have your handout on your phone or iPad or whatever you have. We're going to sing all three stanzas of this hymn. I did my best, Brian, I apologize. But it's in your handout as well. We're going to sing all three stanzas. Why don't we sing stanza 1 in unison in 2 and 3 parts? Do you feel like standing up? You need to move around a little bit? And T. West is going to lead us.
Source and sovereign, rock and cloud, fortress, fountain, shelter, light, judge, defender, mercy, might, light whose life all life endowed, made the church at prayer recall that no single holy name, but the truth behind them all is the God whom we proclaim. Word and wisdom, root and vine, shepherd, savior, servant, lamb, well and water, bread and wine, way who leads us to I am. May the church at prayer recall that no single holy name, but the truth behind them all. God is the God whom we proclaim. Storm and stillness, earth and dove, thunder, tempest, whirlwind, fire, comfort, counselor, presence, love, energies that never tire. May the church at prayer recall that no single holy name, but the truth behind them all is the God whom we proclaim.
Next slide, please. Brian Wren's text, Bring Many Names, was written in 1986 and revised in 1987, 1988, and 1994. And it employs what Proctor Smith would call an inclusive approach as it balances language of male and female, old and young for God. Wren echoes McFague's strategy of a piling up of images for God as he explains how, quote, the hymn begins by inviting us to a carnival of different word pictures of God. As in any carnival, some floats may delight, others may annoy. If but one of them reveals the God of Jesus Christ to you, then perhaps the carnival is worth attending, end quote. I want to thank Michael Hahn for pointing me to that. Thank you. The hymn is also emancipatory because it challenges stereotypical traits that are often associated with certain genders. Wren does the decolonizing work called for by Troger, as Wallace describes how he has, quote, used the balanced form of the hymn to break open some of our stereotypes about God and their reflection on human beings, challenging our colonized imaginations, end quote. Wallace further emphasizes how he shatters stereotypes of mother and father by describing God as a strong mother God in stanza 2 and warm father God in stanza 3. Here the stereotypical expectations of gender roles are reversed, as the mother God is working and creating while the father God is nurturing and caring. Wren describes how, having made that reversal, I find that women whom our stereotypes make invisible become visible to me in the hymn, end quote. The final stanza takes an apophatic approach to naming God and echoes the incomprehensibility of God conveyed in the refrain of Troger's text, as every naming of God is a borrowing of language. In describing this particular text, Wren writes that, quote, if the human race is created in the image of likeness of God, Genesis 1:27, it follows that both femaleness and maleness reveal the divine. And since we are not static but have a changing life cycle, both young and age give glimpses of God. So we are going to sing stanzas 1 through 3 and 6. And if I remember the story correctly from Carl Daw, who I think is here, the tune is named West Chase because Carlton Young lived on West Chase Drive, which is where I currently reside in Nashville. So every time I sing this hymn, thank you, Carl, for sharing that story. So 1 through 3 and 6.
in glory, living, loving God. Hail and Hosanna, bring many names. Strong Mother God, working night, day, planning all the wonders of creation, setting each equation, genius at play. Hail and Hosanna, strong Mother God. Warm Father God, hugging every child, feeling all the strains of human living, caring and forgiving till we're reconciled. Hail and Hosanna, warm Father God. Great living God, never fully known, joyful darkness far beyond our seeing, closer yet than breathing, everlasting home. Hail and Hosanna, great living God.
Thanks, Brian, for doing all that. I apologize. I'm not as tech-oriented. So that was Bring Many Names. Sorry, this is why I don't like using the tablet. It just ran away from me. There we go. All right. So while Wren's inclusive and balanced discussion of female and male is helpful, sorry, this is why I usually have paper, but it's not well for me today. The question is how to affirm that God gives glimpses of the divine nature in not only those who are female or male, but also to those who are intersex. As Duck and Wilson Kastner argue, quote, using many masculine and no feminine images for God sends the message that women are not made in the image of God and thus are less valuable than men, end quote. Correspondingly, when only feminine and masculine images for God are used, the message is sent that all those who do not identify as women or men, including some intersex individuals, are less valuable and are not made in God's image. So how might a sexually polymorphic and reading of Genesis 1:27 as male to female be incorporated in our congregational song? Next slide, please. There are texts that avoid using binary language for humanity and God, using an inclusive and expansive approach. One helpful resource is our 2019 collection from the Hymn Society, Songs for the Holy Other, hymns affirming the LGBTQIAS2S+ community. Songs such as Dan Damon's As Colors in the Sky describe the experience of those who live outside of the sex-gender binary. The collection also explicitly names those who are intersex as one of the groups it aims to serve. And the working group who put it together characterized the title as a, quote, self-conscious claiming of otherness as holy and beloved by God, end quote. In the introduction to the collection, Daw Jr. speaks to the desire of those who have been labeled as wholly other, WHOLLY, and reflect the rainbow diversity of God's creation to reclaim their holiness. He says, quote, Human otherness of whatever kind provides a sacramental reminder of the ultimate otherness of God, an openness to human otherness that has the potential to enlarge our perception of and receptivity to divine otherness, end quote. Next slide, please. Adam Tice's 2014 text, Quirky, Queer, and Wonderful, reflects these goals, acknowledging the, quote, need for hymns that celebrate diversity as a reflection of God's identity, end quote. The refrain supports a sexually polymorphic theology where intersex people and all humans, male to female, are made in God's image. Additionally, Galatians 3:28, there is no longer male and female, is one biblical text where intersex people can see themselves reflected. This passage is in quite a few hymns, including Tice's Quirky, Queer, and Wonderful. Particularly the fourth stanza illustrates the eschatological vision of a world without these barriers. So what we're going to do today, so make sure I'm doing this right, it's on your right-hand side. We're going to sing the tune set to Royal Oak. We're going to sing the refrain, stanza 4, and refrain. But I have to say, before you do that, Brian, on the left-hand side, Sally Ann Morris wrote an amazing tune, the Q tune, but it's more of a through composed, and so because I just wanted to do the one stanza, but please do know that Sally wrote this wonderful tune, which is in Songs for the Holy Other. But today we're going to sing Royal Oak, so refrain, stanza 4, refrain. Do you need to stand again?
Quirky, queer, and wonderful, distinct, unique, and odd. All of our humanity reveals the face of God. In Christ, the false divisions of gender, class, and race can never separate us from God's abundant grace. Quirky, queer, and wonderful, distinct, unique, and odd. All of our humanity reveals the face of God.
That hymn does have a Hymn Society connection. I spoke, I think, in 2014 and said we needed more joyful queer hymns. And so Adam said, okay, I'm going to write this. And he wrote it. So thank you, Adam, for writing that. Slide 15, the next one, please. Ruth Duck's 1997 text, Sacred the Body, also celebrates the rich diversity of human embodiment. Liturgical scholar Teresa Berger describes this text as one where, quote, the author calls for respect for persons, bodies, and difference, without ever locking such respect into a binary model of sexual difference. The text lacks any specific naming of male and female bodies, end quote. Indeed, the second stanza illustrates how bodies are varied, the difference is holy and a gift of the maker, so let us honor each story and song. So we're going to sing stanza 2, and again, I offer you 2 tunes. There's always so many great tunes, right? Mark Miller's, I think this just came out in his new collection, on the left is set to the tune Dr. Tracy West, but today we're going to sing stanza 2 to Colin Gibson's tune Tenderness, which is on your right. So just stanza 2, feel free to sing parts.
sizes, pale full of color, both fragile and strong. Holy the difference, gift of the Maker, so let us honor each story and song.
Next slide, please. Additionally, there are texts that offer ways to incorporate sexually polymorphic understandings of God. Amish Cornelia's 2019 text, God of Many Faces, from Songs from the Holy Other, depicts a God of many faces, many genders, many names, and many bodies, while also mentioning the singing of expansive new songs. So we'll sing all 4 stanzas. Let's do 1 and 4 in unison and 2 and 3 in parts.
God of many faces, we offer our praise, singing your glory through all of our days. Here ever grown as once fragile, now strong, carrying melodies in expansive new songs. God of many genders, our world reflects you. Sunrise and sunset uniting our house, woven into a city with jewels all shades, houses of ruby and walls rode with jade. God of many names, we invite you to show us the new names that reflect our true souls. Breathe with your Holy Spirit to give us your word that will indwell dry bones, granting new life once heard. God of many bodies, abide within us, shifting more each day through time and through stars. Come sanctify our bodies, all fashioned by you. Holier every day, still becoming more true.
Next slide, please. Another is Carl P. Dodd Jr.'s 1990 text, Wondrous God More Named Than Known, which uses multiple biblical non-gendered metaphors for God, such as pregnant, silence, lively, calm, singer of creation psalms, great I am of burning bush. And in the 4th stanza, Dodd Jr. not only speaks to the need to, quote, recognize that all our descriptions of God are inadequate because they attempt to extrapolate the infinite from the finite, end quote. He also begins the stanza with the line, God not female, God not male. In conversing with Carl, who is a dear friend and mentor, he says, quote, "The opening line of the fourth stanza now seems to me to have even wider implications than it did when I first wrote it," end quote. He realizes that this text can now be heard as emancipatory language that makes those who identify outside of the sex-gender binary feel that they too are reflected in God's image. For more on this text and another of Dodd Jr.'s texts, he wrote a new translation of Coordinatus ex parentis. His translation is From the Parent's Heart of the Firstborn. You mostly know it as Of the Fathers Love Begotten. But this text can be found in the New Mennonite Hymnal Voices Together. And I talk about this in my chapter, what comes from a quote from Carl: "What we think is new is in fact very old," to remind us that there are a lot of things that we can retrieve from our tradition that are actually originally were not gendered, but we gendered them, particularly in our 19th and 20th century translations. So you can look at that chapter in Spirit and Truth, A Vision of Episcopal Worship. So I apologize, I didn't have it set to 4 parts, but I know this is the Hymn Society and you all know the parts. So we're gonna sing it to Dix, and we'll sing all 4 stanzas, and feel free just to sing parts as you are able on those stanzas. So yeah, all 4 stanzas.
Rise in body or in spirit. Wondrous God, more named than known, give us firm and certain groan, grace to doubt what we surmise, whence we miss the glad surprise, when we find your truth exceeds all the forecast of our creeds. Pregnant silence, lively calm, singer of creation's psalm, great I am of burning bush, still resist our urge to push, till you fit the names we choose, shadows of the light we lose. Save us from proud empty claims, in our zeal to give you names. Let our notions be expressed, not to limit but suggest views that icon-like disclose splendor more than we suppose. God not female, God not male, God for whom all labels fail, truth beyond our verbal games, life too vast to bound with names. From vain world lust set us free to embrace your mystery.
You're way ahead of me, Brian. Thank you. Utilizing Proctor Smith's notion of emancipatory language, Wallace contends that, quote, "the theological assumption underlying emancipatory language is that God is engaged in struggles for emancipation, including the emancipation of women, and identifies with all those who struggle." This presentation builds on the work of Proctor Smith, arguing for the emancipation of intersex individuals as well. Robin also writes that, quote, "the problem with androcentric language is that it makes women invisible. Therefore, one task of emancipatory language is to make women visible by naming them, both those present in worship and those in the tradition as individuals and as a gender, end quote. Throughout my book, I underscore the importance of naming intersex. And so an additional task of emancipatory language is to make intersex people visible by naming them. If anyone knows of a song that uses the word intersex, please let me know. But as far as I know, there are no examples from congregational song that explicitly name intersex people. But some scholars and intersex people themselves draw comparisons between historical references to eunuchs in the past with those today who are gender variant and have intersex traits. Eunuch is an umbrella term that includes three categories. The first is those who are eunuchs by nature because they had gender indefinite genitalia and would today be considered to have intersex traits. There were those who were castrated, and they chose to be so either for health reasons or as a result of ascetic zeal. And the third category is those who were forced to be castrated either as punishment or to become a slave. The story of the Ethiopian eunuch from Acts chapter 8, verses 26 to 40 is one that is recounted and referenced in a few hymns, such as Dave Bjorland's 2018 text, I Met a Stranger on the Road, which you can see here on the left. Yet very few songs actually use the word eunuch. When I looked up eunuch at hymnary.org, I came up with 6 results, while a search for Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 40 came up with 32. I would like to thank Dwayne Best, who just recently alerted me to Dan Damon's song, which you can see here, A Eunuch Worships God, which doesn't come up on the hymnary search, unfortunately. But it does explicitly use the word eunuch in the first 3 stanzas to tell the story of Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 40. Next slide, please. Another text that uses the word eunuch that did come up in the hymnary search is the 2002 text from The Spirit Called on Philip by Daniel B. Merrick. And this text tells the story from Acts and in stanza 3 explicitly uses the word eunuch. In the future, there will hopefully be examples from congregational song that are written by intersex people that use the word intersex and that explicitly name intersex people as welcome in worship and made in God's image, possibly drawing from other biblical texts that reference eunuchs, such as Isaiah chapter 56, verses 1 through 8, that use a sexually polymorphic understanding of Genesis 1:27. And additionally, it would be wonderful to have texts that highlight the queer aspects of Acts chapter 8, verse 26 to 40, that could be written from the perspective of Simeon Bacchus, the Ethiopian eunuch, who again, General Convention was weird this year, but I think in the Episcopal Church, we are now going to have a day for the Ethiopian eunuch, Simeon Bacchus, on August 27th. As most of the texts that do talk about this passage focus on Philip and are written from his perspective. So for all you hymn writers in the room, and for all of you all online, please write these hymns. We need these texts. Last slide, please. So I thought we would close today with Mary Louise Mel Bringle's 2006 text, Sing a New World into Being, which references Galatians 3:28 in the second stanza, as well as highlighting the gifts of human difference. This hymn really embodies the desire to sing the world that God imagines. So again, we're giving you lots of options. Brian Hayne wrote the tune that is on the left-hand side, which can be found in Songs for the Holy Other, but I figured we would sing the version on the right-hand side set to Nettleton. So let's do stanza 1 in unison and 2 through 4 in parts. So please stand in as you are able.
Sing a new world into being, sound a bold and hopeful theme. Find a tune for silent yearnings, lend your voice and dare to dream. Dream a church where all our worship find their lives and loves belong. Sing a new world into being, sing as Christ inspires your song. Sing a new world into being, where each gender, class, and race bring its rainbow gifts and colors to God's limitless embrace, where the lines that once divided form instead the ties that bind. Sing a new world into being, risk transforming heart and mind. Sing a new world into being, where the homeless find a home, where no children ever hunger, but are filled with God's shalom, where all people work for justice, where all hate and vengeance cease. Sing a new world into being, raise the harmonies of peace. Sing a new world into being, join the ancient prophets' cry for a time of health and plenty, when all tears have been wiped dry, where compassion flows like waters, pouring balm for all who grieve. Sing a new world into being, live the promise you believe.
Thank you all, and I really look forward to our time for discussion. So questions both from here. I don't know if somebody has a wireless mic. Great. So if you have any questions here, or for those who are online, I really look forward to our time to discussion. Thank you again for the great privilege of being able to share this work with you. Thank you.
I'll just speak from the back here. Thank you so much, Steph. We're so grateful for this really both deeply considered and fascinating and prophetic presentation. Thank you so much. I'm going to begin with a question that's come up on the Zoom. Please have your hand up for questions, and I remind you that you need to speak into the microphone so that those joining on Zoom will be able to hear, and Dave Bjorlin is very kindly going to be the runner for the mic, so he's very highly qualified, overqualified mic runner. Thank you, Dave. So this is a question first from Cime Montero, joining from Brazil. And Cime raises, living in a country where the main language is gendered, where the language is masculine, Portuguese has gender for all things, but we, Cime says, try to use inclusive language as much as possible, trying to use neutral words like people, person, and someone can correct my Portuguese pronunciation, but criança for child, and others, is more inclusive. And she raises the difficulty, Cime, I'm going to do my best to reflect what you've said, the difficulty that even words that call for greater inclusivity, like homosexuality in Portuguese is a masculine word, and feminism is a masculine word. So Cime, for example, doesn't feel herself included even in these words that are meant to express ideas like this. So what to do, question mark, I think is the best way I can encapsulate what she's said.
Thank you so much for that question. And since most of my interviews were conducted in German, German is a very gendered language, but we have der, die, das, so there is das, which is gender neutral. There was also the question because Herr is the word for Lord, which is also the word for Mr. In German, so this was very problematic. And there were some who were able to use that word Herr as a kind of placeholder so that it was a masculine word, but their imagination was not thinking of anything gendered. There's also, in using that gender neutral word in German was problematic because it's usually used for inanimate objects. And so there are these not very nice connotations that you are an it in German. Although are, the word es. So there are some who are reclaiming it. So there's often that movement of taking something that might be problematic but reclaiming it. There's also the ability to make up new things. We have Sie sehr in English, and similar words are being created in German. So possibly I am not a Portuguese speaker, but maybe there's the possibility in Portuguese to also think creatively about creating new terms if the ones that we have are too problematic. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. And just before we go to a question in the room, and I invite you to raise your hands, I'll just say we have many poets in the Zoom room who are devising amongst themselves poetic solutions. So thank you, all of you who are having a lively discussion in the chat. And before we go to a question, I'd like to lift up Robin Knowles-Wallace, who is joining on Zoom. Robin says, please say aloud, my thanks to Steph for how she has moved my 1997 work to the next stage in ways I could not have foreseen.
No, I couldn't have done this work without Robin and all those, as I said, who laid the groundwork in the feminist movement. So thank you to Robin and all those who've done that work.
Hi, Steph. I remember hearing this, and I'm maybe just asking this just to make sure I heard it correctly, that when you were doing your, I think, ethnographic approach and with your interviews, that you had a lot of the folks you were talking to who seemed to appreciate when, like, the Trinitarian formula has been problematized to death, but to find a way where they use it, but then they also use more expansive things together, and it's not like one is bad and the other is good, and we can't use the bad one, we can only use the good one. Was that something that came up with multiple folks in your research, or was it just one or two outlying examples of people who preferred to have both in the setting at the time, so going through the liturgy?
It really was a mix, and it depended on how that person self-identified. So for those who identified as a hermaphrodite, it was problematic for them. For those who identified more as, I identify as a woman, they're like, it doesn't really bother me, but they did say, I could see how this could be problematic. So I think it was a more of what makes me feel comfortable, but also the recognition that what makes me comfortable might not make someone else comfortable. And so that's why I really latched on to Sally McFague's, this notion of piling up of images, because as I say to folks, it's so difficult because women still have so far to go and are still made invisible. There are trans folks who have transitioned and worked so hard to say, I am a woman. And so in order to recognize that, to be able to use terms that acknowledge that and recognize that and name that, but also acknowledge and recognize, name those who are non-binary. And so that piling up of this is what we have and adding on brothers and sisters and siblings, that's a way to try to make everyone feel included and named and recognized.
Paulita, and I would like to piggyback off of some of the statements that were made in the plenary this morning about the fact that people are very attached to the traditional pieces of hymns. And what is a way to introduce this more robust way of thinking to groups that are holding on to the fact that it's not the right hymn if it's not using that text?
Well, I always I preach to anyone who can the work that the Mennonite Committee did in their hymnal and Voices Together, and I encourage you to read that article that Adam and Sarah wrote, which talks about the process of taking these well-beloved hymns and thinking about tweaking language here and there to be more. But as a professor, I'm always preaching education, that you can't just, and you can come sometimes subversively sneak some things in and people don't recognize what just happened. But I think it's also important to educate, whether that's through preaching, whether that's through an educational forum, to have those discussions, because as the Episcopal Church is doing now, these revisions, they learned that if you actually explain to people why you're doing what you're doing, you have a much better chance of getting them on board with you rather than just, this is what we're doing. And so I think education is such an important piece in doing that. I hope that answers your question.
We have time for one more question, so Carl?
To follow up on your observation, There is a very wonderful article in Worship, I can't tell you when, but by John Baldwin, who is an excellent Jesuit liturgist. And it's his whole argument is that we need to make a difference between idols and icons. That idols are in fact dead and icons are alive. And working for language that is iconic will make us unhappy with idols. And so that's one of our goals, is to bring alive the language as icons, which helps to make them more godlike.
Thank you, Carl.
And I think, Hillary, or do you?
Thank you, Steph. Will you join me in thanking Steph again one more time?
Thank you, T. West, for singing.